Hey Geek, so if you're brand new to cameras and you're thinking of buying your first real camera, one of the things that you might be wondering is, do you need a gimbal? And this is primarily important if you actually want to stabilize your footage. And there's many ways you can stabilize this. Obviously you can do this in post or in your video editor, but I really like to keep things simple. And so the first type of stabilization that I want to show you is the most important one, and that is the stabilization in your camera. And it's quite often known as in-body stabilization. So there's two main types of stabilization. One that is hardware based, where your actual sensor inside your camera body moves around with motion. That is the best type. And then the other one is software stabilization or e-stabilization. And quite often this really introduces a really heavy crop. So crop is basically zooming in. And in my personal experience, my preference is always the physical in-body stabilization. So as of right now, as an example, I have the stabilization turned off on this camera, and the camera that I'm using is the Sony A7IV. So you can kind of get an idea of how things look like whenever you don't have in-body stabilization. And so I highly recommend that if you are looking for your very first camera, look at the type of stabilization that it has. And the one thing that you want to look at is whether or not it has a physical in-body stabilization versus one that just has e-stabilization. Okay, so now I actually have my in-body stabilization on the Sony A7IV. They have this standard stabilization and active stabilization, which is what I'm using. And more often than not, whenever you do use some type of stabilization, the more stabilized it is through the camera, the more of a crop that you're gonna get, so it's gonna get zoomed in. So kind of take that into account. But as you can probably tell, the stabilization is much better whenever you are using the more active stabilization, in this case with my Sony A7IV on your camera. And then there is another type of stabilization that you have that is hardware based, and that is lens stabilization. So on the Sony A7IV, it has this thing called OIS, so that's optical image stabilization, and other cameras have something very similar. And at least from my experience, it doesn't make too much of a difference whenever you combine your hardware in-body stabilization and your lens stabilization. And it really depends mostly on how good the stabilization is with the camera. So if the camera already has really good in-body stabilization, then I don't really see a big benefit in getting a lens with stabilization, which quite often costs more than a lens without it. And here is another example of stabilization. So right now, I don't have the stabilization on. I am walking. And this is how things will look like if you have completely no stabilization at all. And I really don't recommend this. However, there are times where you might not want stabilization, specifically if you're not moving around much. But if you are going to be walking around and moving around a lot, then having stabilization matters a lot. So let me show you how that looks like. All right, so now I actually have the active stabilization on, and hopefully you can tell the difference. The overall stabilization should be better, less jitteriness and jerkiness. But at the same time, you should also see some type of crop or a zoomed in look. And so the other big part of it, and I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, is the whole crop factor or zoomed in look. So right now I have no stabilization on, so there's actually no crop at all. So in this case, you're gonna get all of the picture, the whole entire frame or sensor, depending on your camera. However, when you move it over to some type of in-body stabilization, almost always you're going to get some type of crop. So here we are with active stabilization, and you can probably tell that there is a kind of crop to it, and it really depends a lot on your camera and also the different resolutions that it has. And typically if it is a higher resolution like 4K, it's probably going to crop even more whenever you stabilize, because it has to process more resolution. But this is how things look like with active stabilization while you're walking and vlogging. And also another factor in stabilization is the type of lens that you use. And so there's going to be different focal lengths. And so if you're not familiar with what that means, just basically there's different ways in which the camera looks like it's zoomed in or it's closer. So you have wide focal lengths, things are wider, you can see more things, and the stabilization doesn't look as good whenever things are wide. And then for focal lengths that's going to be a lot closer, you're going to get better stabilization because things are a lot closer to your subject. Basically you have the whole zoomed in look. And so also take that into consideration. The type of lens that you use also helps in your overall stabilization. For serious YouTubers, check out TubeBuddy, the premier tool news at geekoutdoors.com. Get more done today by checking out the affiliate link in the description area below. And another huge factor that people might not think about before they buy their camera is where are you going to be shooting your videos? And I think this is probably going to be the first thing you need to think about, because that would determine whether or not the stabilization or getting something like a gimbal is really important. So in this case, if you're going to be in a more urban environment where you have like flat roads or flat streets like this, then typically your stabilization is going to be better because it's not on uneven surface. And also you might want to think about the types of environment around you as well. So if you're in an environment where there's not a lot of things in the background, maybe the stabilization might not matter as much or be as noticeable. But whenever you have a lot of objects behind you and your stabilization is bad, it becomes even more apparent because things are moving around. Whereas if you have very little things in the background, you might not be able to tell. And so those are some of the main things that I could see whenever you're thinking about buying your first camera or making an investment and trying to decide whether or not stabilization is worth it. And at least for me, it is definitely worth it. And I highly recommend looking at the camera that you're going to buy and then seeing the type of stabilization it offers, especially the InBody stabilization. And for people looking to get a gimbal, just understand that it is going to be additional cost and also additional time to set this up. But I would argue that for most people, a gimbal is probably not worth the money, and you're better off spending it on a camera with excellent in-body stabilization. And then if you do have the money, then you can also get lenses that have stabilization as well. But overall, look at the camera stabilization, and most importantly, think about the types of videos and where you're going to be using it. So if you actually had any thoughts on this, be sure to leave in the comments there below. And if you did want to see more of my camera tutorials, tips, and thoughts, I do have an entire playlist. I'll leave in the description there below or up here.